Well, Russia's going to do it. The prosecutors in the Donbass are already preparing the cases. I've been studying Russia my entire adult life. First, because I wanted to kill them, and later because I just wanted to understand what the heck's going on there. The Russians are very legalistically minded. Everything, even at the height of the Stalin excesses, people went through due process. It wasn't perfect. It was ugly, but they had to check off the boxes. Did we have a hearing? Yes. Did they confess? Yes. Do we have the confession signed? Yes. Have they done this? Yes. Did we put a bolt in the back of his head? Yes. Okay. So they did all that. They document it. Boom. These aren't guys going out doing knee-jerk reaction and just they're building very, very strong cases against, the perpetrators of the crimes and those who empowered them politically, especially. And I believe Russia. I had an interesting conversation with a guy named Dmitry Azarov. He was a former prime minister of Ukraine during the time of Viktor Yanukovych, the president who was ousted in the 2014 coup. And Azarov said, because we were talking about, okay, what happens, once the fighting's done? He said, well, denazification. I said, well, what does that look like to you? Well, how does that work? He said, well, we're going to have to put in a military type government that will control what's left of Ukraine. And then for a 2 or 3 year period, we will be carrying out denazification. That means that anybody who is affiliated with the Zelensky government, with this right-wing ideology, members of the Azov regiment, members of the other nationalistic units, all these are going to be arrested. Or if they resist, they will be killed. And then they will be re-educated. But that re-education process isn't going to be over in 2 or 3 years. See, Russia has learned the mistakes of the past. There was a big war. A lot of Americans don't know that the CIA funded the Ukrainian or the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalism, Bandera, in a ongoing resistance from 1944 or 1945 to 1952, 53 in what is today Ukraine. It was a very bloody conflict. During that period of time, around 46,000 Soviet soldiers and security forces were killed. About 220,000 Russian civilians were killed, and around 150,000 of these organization of Ukrainian nationalist fighters were killed. This is a massive fighting war. Around 150,000 others were taken prisoner. Many of them fled and came to the United States. They live in Ellenville, New York, just 60 miles south of me, where they have a monument to Stepan Bandera, their nationalistic hero, right there in Heroes Park. They're in Canada, they're in Germany, but a lot of them were captured and sent to camps for long sentences. And many of them were captured in 1953, 54. In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev gave his secret speech to the Presidium, and they began the de-Stalinization phase. And one of the things he did is he shut down the gulags, which I think was a good idea. But in the process, he released these political prisoners, these Banderas, these Nazis, these horrible people who were not re-educated. He released them back into Ukrainian society. And when you study how they insinuated themselves into Ukraine, political infrastructure and the control they had on the development of Ukrainian national identity during the Soviet times. These were people who secretly hated Russians, hated the Soviet Union, but now they're given positions of Soviet responsibility. And then that's what we got today. I mean, because of this, we have this diseased Ukraine today. And the Russians are looking at saying, we're never going to do that again. Next time when we do denazification, the Nazis will never come back. Again, I'm not a human rights guy, so I'm not going to sit here and say, I don't think the Russians are going to be lining them up against the wall and shooting them, but they are going to get very long sentences. And I think the bar for re-education is going to be very, very high. And some of these people have committed atrocities again, the American people don't understand what these people have done. Yeah. I just gave you some numbers that talked about what happened in the 1940s and 50s, and I believe these numbers were unheard. Most of your audience are probably going, what? 250,000 Russian civilians were killed? Yeah. How were they killed? Oh, read the Russian reports. The Banderas surrounded villages, brought out all the women and children, raped them, murdered them, put them in a building, set it on fire, and shouted, Slava Ukraina, glory to the heroes. The same things that Nancy Pelosi shouted in the United States Congress. I guess she didn't realize she's shouting out a slogan that is the Ukrainian equivalent of Sieg Heil. Slava Ukraina is the war cry of the Banderas as they slaughtered Polish and Russian civilians. It should never be said. It's a scope and scale that's unimaginable to most people. Just like the war. I don't know if you saw General Cavoli's speech that he gave to Sweden last month. He's the commander of U.S. forces and Supreme Allied Commander. He spoke in Sweden, and he basically just said, what's happening on the ground in Ukraine is beyond the imagination of any NATO leader. We couldn't even conceive of a war this bloody. The violence that's taking place, we can't. And again, to put this in perspective, during World War II, the United States lost, roughly 300,000 people, combat casualties on both fronts, Pacific and Europe. And we're talking about D-Day, Iwo Jima, battles. We've all seen the movies, and we're like, man, that is the hardest fighting. That's really bad. The Ukrainian army has lost that amount of people in 1 year, which tells you something about the fighting that's taking place. If you've taken a look at the videos of what Mariupol looked like, the moonscape, if you take a look at what Bakhmut looks like and what other towns where this fighting takes place, they're totally leveled. You take a look at the terrain. The level of violence that's taking place was beyond the imagination of a 3-star American general. He said, the U.S. Army is not prepared for this kind of fighting. We're not trained, equipped. We don't have sustainability issues. We don't have the right tactics. We've done nothing right. We can't fight that. This is what we're talking about, ladies and gentlemen. This is what the history of Ukraine is on a scope and scale that we can't imagine. The amount of violence that took place there in the 1940s and 50s, and the violence that's taking place there. And what fuels this violence? Hatred. The Ukrainian nationalists truly hate the Russians. They view them as subhumans. They mock them. They call them orcs. A lot of times they capture these ethnic Russians and they saran wrap them to poles. And then they paint their face green and they beat them and they leave them there to die of exposure. These are good people. Yeah, I can't speak in an informed fashion on the life expectancy of a Ukrainian soldier. I mean, I've heard that. They talk about. They had one guy who I deemed to be credible. Talking about companies being devoured in a day. And this is a battalion. Now, remember, in Bakhmut, we're dealing with brigades. Brigades are composed of multiple battalions. So a battalion is losing 150 guys a day. There's several battalions operating. So you're probably losing close to 1,000 guys a day in Bakhmut. Again, the scope and scale of this violence is something that nobody can imagine. The number of dead is mind-boggling. And the thing about the Ukrainians is, they end up, for the most part, abandoning the battlefield, which means they leave the dead behind. And so, when the Russians are counting casualties, they're not doing it theoretically like we did in Vietnam, where we say, well, we fired X number of artillery shells. We anticipate each artillery shell achieve the following probability of kill, and we estimate that we killed this many Vietnamese. No, they're counting the bodies. They're actually tagging and bagging the dead bodies and getting the names and the passports and doing a list. So when the Russians come up with casualty figures, they tend to be very accurate casualty figures about the number of Ukrainians that have been lost. Well, understand that this war is more than Bakhmut. Right now, there's a lot of attention being put on Bakhmut, but the Russians are carrying out offensive operations throughout the entire line of contact with the Ukrainians. In some places they've been making 5-7 kilometer a day advances. In other places they've been pushed back. It's war. Mm-hmm. Anybody who thinks this is easy, people are like, where's the big Russian offensive? I'm like, what's happening right now? I mean, it's happening as we speak. Well, why aren't they doing big arrow stuff? Well, because the Ukrainians are sort of dug in. And I think I need to make this point. Regardless of what you think of the Ukrainians, whether you call them Nazis or this or that and the other thing, respect them as fighters. These guys are doing something that we can't. No American alive today has gone through what the Ukrainian soldiers are going through right now. Mm-hmm. They're the second best army in Europe today. The best army is the Russian army. The Ukrainians are the second best army. they would take any fighting formation NATO has right now and take it off the map. That's how good they are. These are fighters. They know how to fight. They've been blooded, and they understand how it's like to fight, with a Russian artillery barrage and how to survive in that environment. We don't. We spent the last 20 years chasing villagers in Iraq and chasing goat herders in Afghanistan. I'm not denigrating the guys that got in the occasional firefight over there, but nothing that happened in Afghanistan or Iraq comes close to replicating what's happening right now in Ukraine. So we have to give the Ukrainian soldiers, a nod. We may not like their leader, we may not like their cause, we may not like what they're fighting for, but we have to acknowledge these guys are fighting. You know who acknowledges? The Russians do. Wagner. We talk about Wagner, this vaunted fighting force, but look at the respect they show to the Ukrainians. These are guys that are, they're killing 1,000 of them a day, but the Ukrainians are killing a couple hundred Wagner guys a day. 100 a day. And so the Wagner guys, they have the highest respect for these Ukrainians. They're killing them, they're fighting them, they're going to slaughter them. But at the end of the day, when they get the bodies, Prigozhin, the leader, treats them with respect, puts them in a coffin, and then speaks words to them as they are heroes who died for their country, because he can call them heroes because he knows the heroic fight that they're putting up. And so when people are like, well, why aren't the Russians moving faster? Well, good Lord, because the Ukrainians are fighting. The Ukrainians are putting up resistance. These aren't a bunch of yellow-bellied cowards. These are hard MFs. They're fighting really, really hard for a cause that many of them believe in. Yes, there are territorials that are being recruited that aren't trained, and they're going to the front line, and they're being sacrificed to buy time. But there are an awful lot of hardcore Ukrainian fighters out there that are, have put up a great fight and will continue to put up a great fight. Whatever victory Russia gets will be hard-earned. It's not going to be easy, but it's ongoing as we speak. If Bakhmut falls, and again, I say if, I believe it will. But remember, if you study the Battle of Stalingrad, General Chuikov had, 100 meters of territory on the west bank of the Volga River that he was holding on to that constituted the Soviet control of the city. And the Germans were coming in. And then if anybody had said early on in the phase of Stalingrad that Germany wouldn't be able to push them through that last 100 meters and take the city and have a victory, Vegas wouldn't take those odds. But Germany didn't finish the fight. The Russians were able to hold on, push back, and all that. Who knows how this fight's going to end? I believe that the Russians are going to complete the task of encircling Bakhmut and destroy whatever forces are there. And when that happens, it's interesting. Zelensky just came out and said, if that happens, the reason why he's holding on to Bakhmut so strongly is that if they lose Bakhmut, the Russians will sort of have a clear path to, additional towns to take, Kramatorsk and others. I don't know if that's, propaganda or whatever, but the bottom line is Bakhmut is the final bastion. That was the anchor of the Ukrainian defensive line. And when it falls, Ukraine will have to build a new defensive line. And I believe they're out there digging around right now doing just that, but it will never replicate what they had built for 8 years. Remember, the defenses that Russia's been attacking, the Battle of Bakhmut has been ongoing since May. Non-stop violence. And the Russians have been reducing the most heavily entrenched fortified area in the world. And when Bakhmut falls, that's it. Russia has now pushed through that defensive belt, and they will be able to roll up the Ukrainian defenses. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing. Remember, Vladimir Putin has said, we are going to consolidate our control of Russia. We're going to kick the Ukrainians out of Russia, out of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Lugansk. Right now, Ukraine occupies around 30% of Donetsk. That has to be liberated after the fall of Bakhmut. That's what will happen. And then they will push them back further. And in the process of doing so, I think they will destroy the Ukrainian army as an effective fighting force. So I think that's what we're going to see. If people are expecting, something out of World War II with a giant arrow, big sweeping advances, I don't see that happening. But I see the fall of Bakhmut being the beginning of the end of the Ukrainian resistance, because everything after that will be an attempt to recover from that defeat. The Ukrainians are assembling reserves. They are receiving Western equipment, the Leopard tanks and stuff. But I don't think that that's going to be in numbers sufficient to do anything more than be a temporary harassment. It's sort of like the Battle of the Bulge.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it looked good at the time, but when it finished, everybody went, well, the Germans just blew all their reserves and there's nothing left. There may be a Battle of the Bulge moment for the Ukrainians down the road where they launch this attack and they bloody the Russians' nose. But when that's done, they got nothing left. Russia has everything, and the war will continue. Well, first of all, it's doctrine. The Russians have a doctrine, an approach to war that is logical in terms of, Russia's capacity. Historically, Russia has emphasized artillery. And I think the wisdom of that decision is being played out in Ukraine. The United States has historically made heavier use of close air support. We do combined arms operations where we have artillery, but the artillery has been supplanted in many ways by close air support. Mm-hmm. But that was, that's a legacy doctrine that came out of World War II, and then later on Korea and Vietnam, where we were dealing with air defense systems that weren't as sophisticated as they are today. The integrated air defense network that Russia brings to bear on the battlefield precludes the kind of close air support that we're used to provide. And so artillery now becomes the key. The Russians have learned, though. They had a drone doctrine that was insufficient. It wasn't sufficient to the realities of this battlefield, and that's why they have brought in Iranian technology, adapted that, and redefined their drone approach. The drone war that's taking place in Ukraine right now is mind-boggling in terms of sophistication. The tactics that are used, the counter-drone tactics. It's a giant chess match that's being played out, and that's part and parcel of the artillery war, where you have drones out there finding targets, the artillery shooting, other drones detecting the artillery shooting, so counter battery comes out, radars. It's a very complicated war, but Russia has more artillery than anybody. Mm-hmm. And they have the ammunition to sustain high rates of fire, and so Russia is able to bring more violence down on the enemy than they can bring on Russia. And that's have to think. But Russia's learning. I think the Russians have learned, for instance, when they started this conflict, the basic combat unit used by Russia was called the Battalion Tactical Group. Basically, you take a motorized rifle battalion, you throw some tanks on with it, you throw some artillery on with it, some engineers and reconnaissance. You have this self-sufficient Battalion Tactical Group that can go out and maneuver and fight. What they're finding is that Battalion Tactical Group isn't capable of sustained combat in this environment. It gets eaten up too quick. And if you're defined as a battalion tactical group and it gets broken down and you don't have a group larger than that to absorb them and operate, your combat efficiency drops. So what Russia has done during this pause between the mobilization of 300,000 reservists and what we see today is to reorganize. The battalion tactical group is not the premier thing. They've gone back up to regiments. So you're dealing with the regiment. You have battalions in the regiment, but the regiment's the principal organizational structure, and the regiment is support of a division, and the division's in support of an army. And so what the Russians are doing are making sustainable combat organizational decisions that can absorb the extraordinarily high number of casualties that are taking place on the battlefield, but maintain combat effectiveness. In the West, we've gone to the brigade structure. Now, we always brag that our brigade was capable of defeating the battalion tactical group. Probably not 5 of them, but there was a lot of Russians out there. But the brigade is not a sustainable. If we take our brigade and we throw it into this cauldron here, our brigade will cease to be combat effective in a couple of days, and we don't have an organizational structure capable of sustaining that fight. So we have to start taking a look at how we organize. Brigades doesn't hack anymore. We have to start talking about divisions. What that means is when we speak of a division, we have to accept the fact that we're going to lose brigades. And when you lose a brigade, you still have a division capable of fighting. This is transformed it. The Russians have learned a lot. They've adapted, and they're ahead of the power curve when it comes to being able to field a military capable of sustained combat operations in the modern battlefield. The only other army out there right now that can do this is the Ukrainian army, but they can't do it as well as the Russian army. Georgia has, from the very beginning of its nation, sought to align itself with the West, modern Georgia. And they have been very receptive to American involvement in the development of the Georgian nation. And one of the ways that we get involved is that we bring in non-governmental organizations. It's a standard approach to come in, and you have non-governmental organizations that insinuate themselves into every aspect of Georgian society. Then the U.S. Agency for International Development begins flowing money into these things and targeting, using the NGOs to shape Georgia the way we want Georgia shaped. And there's a lot of resentment right now in Georgia towards the domination of almost every aspect of Georgian society by the United States government, directly and indirectly. So this has manifested itself in the Georgian parliament passing a foreign registration act. I mean, before people react and say, well, that's just absurd. We do it here in the United States. Okay. Yep. If you're a foreign agent, you have to register. The fact is, we've prosecuted people for failure to register. And so, it's what nations do to protect themselves from having foreign powers come in and indirectly take control of the nation. So the Georgians are saying, we want to do a foreign registration act. And all the groups in there that are owned by the United States but don't want to admit that they're owned by the United States are saying, we don't want to have anything to do with this. And so they're right. And look at the United States. We're sitting there telling the Georgians, don't you dare do a foreign registration act. Shame on you. If you do that, we'll sanction you. It's the hypocrisy and the double standard doesn't appear to be. But the Georgians are calling out the decades-long, basically soft coup that's been taking place, where the United States has used non-governmental organizations to take control of every aspect of Georgian society. The Georgian government's trying to gain control of this because it's a risk. Right now, these NGOs are fueling a new Georgian nationalism that is being used by the United States to try and position Georgia to open up a second front against Russia. Now we come back to what I talked about at the beginning. There's a lot of Georgians that recognize that this would be suicide. There's a reason why my wife can't return to Abkhazia today, because Abkhazia has been taken over, Georgians have been evicted, and Russia is guaranteeing its security. The same with South Ossetia. A lot of Georgians don't want to see Georgia permanently lose these territories, although that may have already happened, but they definitely don't want to see more territory stripped away by Russia because of continued conflict. And so in order to stabilize the situation, they want to reduce the indirect influence of the United States. If the United States wants to influence Georgia in the future, they have to do it the old-fashioned way. They have to come in and say, I represent the United States, this is what we want, and give the Georgian people a chance to debate that openly. But you can't have an open debate when the participants of the debate are bought and paid for by the United States, because now it's a fake debate. You've cooked the book, so to speak. And so this is what's happening. It's a very difficult struggle that's taking place in Georgia right now, but it's one that has to happen if Georgia is going to emerge as a truly sovereign state. In order to proclaim yourself as a sovereign state, you must be free of foreign influence, especially the foreign influence that is insidious and you don't know about. And that's why the Foreign Registration Act is so important.